They said she was too big, too broken, too much of a burden. At 16, Lottie Mae was thrown out like garbage into the Montana rain alone, unloved, and terrified. But when she stumbled into the woods and screamed, "Please don't leave me alone," a silent, bearded figure emerged from the shadows. The mountain man, scarred, feared, and forgotten, did something no one expected. What happened next would shake a small town's soul, expose hidden cruelties, and prove that even the most wounded hearts can still protect, heal, and love. Why did he help her, and what did she awaken in him? When a broken girl cried out and a feared man answered, a forgotten corner of the world remembered what mercy looked like, what really happened up on that mountain, and who carried whose salvation. Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that stories like this still matter because, you still believe in kindness, honor, and second chances. If those values live in your heart, then you're part of this story too. Let me know which state you're watching from, give this video a like, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you stories that stir the soul. The door slammed behind her with a thunderous finality, as if the house itself had exhaled its disgust. Rain poured from the heavens in thick, cold sheets, soaking Lottie Mae to the bone before she even stumbled off the porch. Her bare feet splashed in the mud, dress clinging to her in all the wrong ways. Behind her, the window glowed with a sickly yellow light, and her stepfather's silhouette stood motionless, watching, unmoved. "You think someone's going to want a fat, lazy brat like you?" He had spat moments earlier, breath heavy with whiskey and rage. "You're 16, time to learn what the world does with useless things." The screen door had creaked open before she could find the words to plead, and the next thing she knew, she was out in the storm, her only possessions a damp journal pressed to her chest beneath her coat and a heart pounding with shame and fear. She ran first, not knowing where to. Just away. Away from the cruelty in that house, the slurs whispered at school, the mirrors that never gave mercy. She tried to be quiet as she cried, but the sobs came loud and helpless. Her breath hitched with each step, thighs burning, lungs begging her to stop. "Please," she whimpered to no one, "please don't let this be it." The town lights faded behind her. Gravel turned to grass, grass to wet leaves, and soon Lottie found herself at the edge of the forest, where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Her legs buckled, and she fell to her knees in the muck, sobbing into her sleeves. She hadn't wanted much, just a warm place to read, a mother who stayed, a meal without judgment. Maybe, one day, someone who saw her, not just her weight, not just her silence, but the girl underneath. Lightning tore across the sky, and the thunder that followed sounded like a shout from above. Lottie flinched. The trees around her groaned under the weight of the storm, and shadows danced between their trunks like ghosts waiting to pounce. She curled into herself beneath a crooked pine, hugging her journal like a lifeline. It was soaked now, the ink running, the pages swelling. Her drawings, little animals with kind eyes, bled into blurs. Still, she clutched it close, as if the smudged paper could prove she existed. "Don't leave me here," she whispered, not even sure who she was talking to. Her mother? God? The wind? Then louder, more desperate. "Please, don't leave me alone." Her voice echoed into the forest like a thrown stone. No one answered, only the patter of rain, the rumble of distant thunder, and the high-pitched creak of tree limbs above. But something was listening. From deep within the woods, where no path was carved and no child dared wander, something moved. A crunch of wet twigs. A shadow, tall and broad, emerged briefly between flashes of lightning, then vanished again. Lottie's breath hitched, her eyes wide. She pressed her back against the tree trunk, shaking. If the forest had wolves, now would be their time. But the shape came no closer. It only stood, watching from the dark. A man? A bear? Her heart pounded against her ribs like a warning drum. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees. Lottie let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a scream. "Please," she cried again, "don't leave me." But the woods were silent once more, and the girl, drenched and trembling, was left alone with her fear, unaware that her cry had been heard by the one soul the town feared most, a soul just as lost as she was. In the town of Duskwater, tucked between the edge of the piney hills and the stubborn rock of the Montana backcountry, there was no shortage of things people didn't understand but feared anyway. And of all the whispered names that floated on porch breezes and behind church fans, none stirred the air quite like Jonas Carver. He lived somewhere up past Widow's Ridge, in a cabin that hadn't seen paint in 20 years and didn't need any. Children said it had a door made of bark and bones. They said he had a rifle long as a wagon axle and could shoot the wings off a crow without blinking. They said he kept the skull of a bear he killed with his bare hands hanging from his chimney like a warning. Most of it was nonsense, but no one said so out loud. Down at the general store, folks kept their voices low when his name came up. "Reckon he's still alive?" murmured old Tom Dorsey, stacking cans of peaches. "I heard he don't even come down for winter supplies no more." "Maybe eat squirrels raw," added Ruthie Parnell with a snort, her apron smudged with flour. "Or maybe he's dead and just forgot to lay down," another offered, earning a few dry chuckles. But for all their laughing, no one dared take the trail past Widow's Ridge, not after sunset, not even with a lantern. Children dared each other on summer evenings just before fireflies blinked into view to creep 5 steps past the tree line. One boy swore he saw a figure watching from behind the thickest pine, tall as a door frame, with one eye glowing like an ember. That was enough to send them all screaming back to town, delighted and terrified. Still, in a place like Duskwater, truth and fear made good neighbors, and nobody pressed too hard, except Miss Charity Bell. She was the preacher's wife, and not the sort who rattled easy. Small in stature but firm in voice, she moved through town like a woman on a mission from the Lord himself. She'd buried 2 children and delivered 6 more into this world with her own hands, and still had enough grit left to see what others missed. On a Sunday afternoon, when the gossip wheel spun a little too fast outside the church doors, she stopped it with a single sentence. "He ain't cruel," she said, folding her gloved hands tight. "Just wounded." They all turned to look at her, blinking like birds after a gunshot. She didn't flinch. "I saw him once, years ago, when his wife and baby burned up in that fire. He came down to town with ash on his hands and a look in his eyes like death itself had whispered in his ear. Man like that don't come back the same." There was a hush then, thick and uneasy. Even Ruthie Parnell had no retort. "Some men lash out," Charity continued, softer now. "Some go quiet." He went quiet. "Doesn't mean he's a monster." Still, no one knew much about what Jonas did up there in that cabin. He'd been a soldier, they said, fought in wars most folks only read about, came back with a scar down his jaw and a silence deeper than any grave. One day, he just walked out of town with a rucksack and a shovel, built a life in the trees, and hadn't looked back. Until now. For though the people of Duskwater didn't know it yet, Jonas Carver had heard something the night before, a sound that didn't belong in the forest, a cry that cracked through the storm and pierced his solitude like a bell in a burial ground. And even a man who hadn't spoken in 10 years could still recognize the voice of a child begging not to be left behind. The forest had grown darker than night ought to be. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered, clinging to the branches like sorrow. Every leaf dripped, every twig snapped underfoot with the sound of something breaking. Lottie Mae couldn't go any further. Her legs, thick and trembling, gave out beneath her, and she collapsed beside a fallen log, mud squelching beneath her dress. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her body ached with a deep, hollow weariness that no amount of rest could fix. She had run on fear and fury, but now both had drained out of her like rainwater through cracked earth. She laid her head down, cheek to bark, her journal clutched beneath her arm, and closed her eyes. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called out. Somewhere farther, a branch creaked like a warning. She hadn't eaten in a day and a half. Her stomach groaned, but louder still was the ache in her chest. The echo of every cruel word her stepfather had spat words sharp enough to slice through hope. She was nothing, a burden, an embarrassment. No one would look for her, no one ever had. The cold began to sink in again, no longer numbed by adrenaline. Her fingers tingled, her lips trembled. A part of her wanted to sleep, to sink into the earth and disappear. Maybe that would be easiest. But then the sound came, not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps, heavy ones. Purposeful. She froze, breath held tight. Her eyes searched the darkness, but saw only shadows. Then, between two tall pines, a figure emerged. Enormous. Still. His shoulders blocked the moonlight. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a long coat soaked through and sagging like old bark. He did not move closer. He only watched. Lottie's heart slammed against her ribs. She scrambled backward, slipping in the mud. Who's there?" The man said nothing. "Please." Her voice broke, a whisper lost in the trees, then louder, like she could throw it at him to make him reel. "Please don't leave me alone." And there it was, that sound in her voice. The rawness, the kind that came from a place deeper than fear. It was the sound of someone used to being left behind. It cut through the silence like a blade. The figure shifted. Jonas Carver hadn't spoken a word to another soul in 10 years. Not since the fire, not since he buried 2 coffins with his bare hands and walked into the hills to forget the taste of language. But now he stood, unmoving, as a girl sobbed into the ferns, begging not to be abandoned. He should have turned, should have let the forest close behind him like it always did. But something in that cry held him fast. It wasn't just pain, it was purity. She wasn't begging for attention or mercy. She was asking to matter, if only for a moment longer. He stepped forward. Lottie flinched, curling into herself. He raised one hand, not fast, not threatening, and set it palm out, as if to say, "I won't harm you." The girl's cries quieted, but her eyes stayed wide with fear. Without a word, Jonas dropped his pack to the ground. From it, he pulled out a thick wool blanket wrapped in oilcloth. He knelt down, not close, and placed it gently on a dry patch of moss between them. Then he stood again and stepped back into the trees. He didn't leave. He waited. Lottie stared at the blanket, then back at him. Her fingers shook as she reached out and dragged it toward her. It was warm, real, offered without threat. Jonas watched as she wrapped it around herself and curled beneath the log again. She was asleep before she knew it, and he remained silent, still as a quiet sentinel among the trees, guarding a stranger whose cry had stirred something he thought long buried, the instinct to protect. The dawn came slow through the mist, touching the trees with a pale silver light. Lottie stirred beneath the heavy wool blanket, disoriented by the stillness. The forest, damp and hushed, no longer felt like a place of punishment. It felt watched. Not by danger, but by someone who'd chosen not to leave. When she sat up, stiff and sore, the figure was still there, leaning against a tree trunk a few paces away. He hadn't slept. His eyes, shadowed beneath his hat, met hers for a moment. Then he turned and walked. Lottie hesitated. Her mind screamed warnings, every story of dangerous men who lured girls into the woods. But her heart, inexplicably, didn't feel afraid. Her legs were weak, but she followed. They didn't speak. The man moved with slow, deliberate steps, occasionally stopping to help her over a root or steep slope. He didn't touch her, just offered a hand, palm up, like someone who knew what fear felt like and didn't want to stir it further. They climbed higher into the hills, where the trees grew thicker and the wind whispered through pines. After nearly an hour of trudging through silence, Lottie saw it. A cabin, rough-hewn and half-swallowed by the woods. Smoke rose from a crooked chimney, and a stack of firewood stood neatly beside the door. He pushed the door open and stepped aside. She entered slowly, unsure what to expect. The inside was dim but warm. A fire crackled in a stone hearth. The floor was swept clean, though worn. A simple table sat beneath a narrow window, and beside it a rocking chair stood still. There were no frills, no signs of life beyond the essentials, except for the walls. They were lined with scars, not just age and use, but memory. A pair of tiny shoes nailed to a beam, a cracked picture frame, empty. A child's wooden toy, faded by time, sitting on the mantel like an offering. Lottie didn't stare. She just stood, unsure where to step. The man set a loaf of bread on the table, along with a small jar of jam and a tin cup of water. Then he stepped back, nodding once toward the chair by the fire before retreating to the far corner of the room where a narrow cot sat, still made. He didn't speak. She sat. The bread was coarse but good, and the jam tasted of berries and effort. Her fingers trembled as she ate, not from fear now, but from the strange foreign sensation of being offered something without cost. No ridicule, no sneer, just food, warmth, and silence. When she looked up, he was carving something wood shavings gathered at his feet, but his eyes flicked to her, briefly, as if to make sure she hadn't vanished. She didn't speak either. Not yet. She didn't know his name, didn't know why he helped her, and didn't dare break the stillness that seemed sacred in this place. But as the fire crackled and the wind rattled gently against the window panes, Lottie leaned back in the chair and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Safe. Not understood. Not yet. But safe. And in the silence, she found that was enough. The days came quiet in the hills, carried in on ribbons of mist and the low songs of mourning doves. The forest never rushed, and neither did the man who lived within it. Time moved differently at Jonas Carver's cabin, marked not by clocks or bells, but by the crackle of the fire, the groan of floorboards beneath careful steps, and now the sound of a girl trying not to be useless. Lottie Mae rose with the sun, every muscle aching, her legs still sore from that desperate night in the woods, but she moved anyway. Jonas had not told her to stay, but he hadn't asked her to leave either, and so she made herself useful in the only ways she knew how. The first morning, she swept the floor. He watched from the doorway, arms folded across his broad chest, eyes unreadable beneath the shadow of his brow. She didn't ask permission, just did it, awkwardly bending her large frame around the table legs, wheezing softly as she worked. When she was done, he gave a quiet grunt, neither approving nor dismissive, and stepped inside without a word. The next day, she found the chicken coop behind the cabin. 5 hens, scrappy and suspicious, flapped at her when she opened the gate. She laughed for the first time in days, just a breath of it when one pecked her boot. That evening, Jonas found 3 warm eggs in a chipped bowl on the table. He looked at her. She didn't say anything. He didn't either. But the next morning, there was a spare pair of boots beside the door, bigger than hers, but tied neatly, dry. When she tried to chop wood, she nearly dropped the axe on her own foot. Jonas snatched it from her, not roughly, but with a sharpness that stilled her breath. He didn't scold her, just handed her a smaller hatchet, lighter and safer. Then, without speaking, he split 3 thick logs in the time it took her to split one. She didn't stop, though, didn't look for praise. She just kept going until her arms shook and her palms stung. Jonas watched from the porch, chewing on a stem of dried grass. He didn't smile, but the next time she looked up, he wasn't chewing anymore. In the evenings, Lottie sat near the fire and scribbled in her journal. She never hid it, but she never offered it up either. The pages were filled with quick sketches of chickens, pine cones, the outline of the mountain ridge beyond the trees. And, once, when Jonas passed behind her, he paused, just for a breath. His eyes lingered on a page where she had drawn the cabin, its crooked roof and curling smoke, rendered in surprising detail. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away too fast either. She tried to thank him once, standing awkwardly with her hands clenched at her sides. I'm real grateful," she said, eyes fixed on the floorboards. "I know you didn't have to." Jonas gave a grunt. Deep, non-committal. She smiled anyway. Each night, the silence between them grew less sharp. It became something softer, something earned. In Jonas's eyes, still shadowed by loss, something began to flicker. Not warmth, not yet, but recognition. Because in Lottie Mae, he saw someone who refused to let the world beat her into silence. And in her quiet, persistent strength, the ice that had gripped his heart for so long began, almost imperceptibly, to crack. The wind blew colder that evening, curling around the corners of the cabin with a whisper-like memory. Inside, the fire hissed low in the hearth, casting warm shadows across the walls. Lottie Mae was alone in the main room. Jonas had gone out to the shed before dusk, as he did every few nights, and hadn't returned yet. He never explained where he went or why, and she didn't press. Some silences didn't want breaking. She was looking for a needle. Her dress had torn at the shoulder while hauling firewood, and she was determined to mend it herself. She checked the kitchen drawers first, then the shelf beside the stove. Finally, she opened a narrow drawer in the small desk, pushed up against the far wall, a drawer Jonas had never locked, but also never touched in her presence. The needle wasn't there, but something else was. At the bottom of the drawer, beneath a yellowing newspaper clipping and a crumpled hand-drawn map of the hills, lay a photograph, faded, framed in a cracked piece of glass, wrapped carefully in an old handkerchief. She shouldn't have looked, but something about the care with which it had been hidden made her hands slow, reverent. She unwrapped it as though it might crumble in her palms. It was a woman and a child. The woman, young, with long dark hair pulled back from a gentle face. Her eyes, startlingly clear, even in the faded print, seemed to hold a quiet laughter. She stood beside a girl, maybe 5 or 6, who wore a simple dress and held a carved wooden bird in her hands. The child's smile was crooked, mischievous, and unmistakably real. They stood in front of this very cabin. A lifetime ago. Lottie's breath caught. Her fingers grazed the cracked glass, tracing the outline of the mother's hand resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder. A sound outside made her jump. She quickly rewrapped the photo and placed it back exactly as she'd found it. By the time Jonas stepped through the door, brushing pine needles from his coat, she was sitting at the table, stitching her dress with thread she'd found on a shelf. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But that night, the silence between them shifted. She lay awake on her cot beside the fireplace, staring up at the wooden beams above, listening to the rhythm of the forest outside. The cabin creaked in familiar places. The fire snapped low, and from the far end of the room, where Jonas slept behind a simple curtain, came a sound she'd never heard before. A sob. It was quiet at first. One breath hitched, then another. A sound like something buried long ago clawing its way to the surface. Lottie turned toward the sound, but did not speak. Her eyes brimmed, unbidden. Then she heard it, just one word, choked and trembling from the mouth of a man who hadn't spoken her name in years. Clara. The name hung in the air like smoke, heavy, sacred, and suddenly the photograph made sense. Lottie rolled onto her back, blinking at the rafters through tears she hadn't expected. She did not know who Clara was, not really, but she knew the weight of a name spoken in grief. She knew the ache of remembering someone the world had already forgotten. She didn't mention the photograph. She didn't need to. Some wounds didn't need tending with words. They just needed to be seen. The snow had long melted into the roots of the hills, and spring crept back into the woods like something cautious but kind. Trees budded with green promises, and the creek behind Jonas's cabin, once frozen and silent, now sang again with a voice soft and steady. Lottie Mae felt the change in the earth before she saw it. It was in the way the birds returned to the branches each morning, in the looseness of the wind, and in the sudden ache in her hands to make something grow. She hadn't asked for it. But one morning, after breakfast, Jonas stepped out of the cabin without a word and pointed toward a small patch of earth just beyond the chicken coop. It was flat, sunlit, and half choked with weeds. He handed her a rusted old trowel and a burlap sack with seed packets inside beans, carrots, squash, and turned back toward his shed. He didn't say anything, but Lottie understood. It was hers. She spent the next days on her knees in the dirt. Her back hurt, and the sun burned the back of her neck, but she didn't stop. Each weed pulled felt like untying a knot in her chest. Each seed planted was a prayer, quiet and trembling. Let something good take root. Just once. Jonas didn't hover. But he passed by more often now, sometimes with tools over his shoulder, sometimes with nothing but a glance. She caught him watching once, just for a second, before he turned away and pretended to be checking the chicken wire. He never offered instruction. He didn't need to. In the evenings, when her hands were too sore to dig any longer, Lottie returned to her notebook. She'd kept it close since the night she left town, even though the pages were smudged and wrinkled from rain. She sat on the porch steps, her boots untied, sketching the world around her. The hens, each with their own personality. The stream, tangled with reeds. A chipmunk that had grown bold enough to steal from the woodpile. She didn't draw them like a scientist. She drew them like someone trying to understand how they survived. One evening, Jonas approached without her hearing. She was too focused, her tongue pressed to her lip in concentration as she shaded in the curve of a deer's neck. When she finally looked up, he was standing behind her, eyes fixed on the open page. She moved to close it, startled. He raised a hand not to stop her, but to wait. Then he knelt slowly beside her, his knees cracking under the effort. He studied the sketch. The lines were clean, full of life. The deer's eyes held something Lottie hadn't meant to put there: hope, maybe, or understanding. Jonas exhaled through his nose, a sound almost like amusement, and then, without thinking, he smiled. Just a little, just once, but it was real. Lottie didn't say anything. She only watched the moment stretch between them like a thread not easily broken. When he stood, he gave her a nod, small but firm, a gesture that said more than words could have managed. It said, "I see you." She closed the notebook carefully and held it close. And that night, as the stars blinked awake over the mountains and the soft scent of turned soil drifted in through the open windows, Lottie Mae lay in bed and thought, not for the first time, that maybe life wasn't just something to survive. Maybe, if she stayed very still and very brave, it could grow. The day was overcast, and the light coming through the cabin window carried the color of ash. It was the kind of gray that made everything feel quieter, more fragile, as though even the trees had agreed not to speak too loud. Jonas was sharpening his knife by the fire, the steady scrape of stone against steel the only sound in the room. Lottie sat at the table, her notebook open before her, but she hadn't touched her pencil in over an hour. She was holding something in her lap, a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, soft from too many creases. Her fingers moved over it like it was something sacred and dangerous all at once. Jonas didn't look up, but he noticed the silence shift, heavy in a way it hadn't been before. "I wrote this when I was 10, she said finally, her voice small but steady. "Never showed it to anyone." He paused, set the knife and whetstone aside, still didn't speak. She opened the letter carefully. The folds were cracked, and the ink had bled in spots from where tears had fallen long ago. She didn't read it out loud. She didn't need to. The words had burned themselves into her memory. "I wrote it to my real father," she said, "after my mom died." Her eyes stayed on the letter, but her mind drifted far behind it, into the ache of a smaller, lonelier version of herself. She got sick, real sudden. They said it was her heart, but I think it broke before her body did. Her voice caught. She blinked fast. After that, he moved in. Wayne. He was always around before, just like a shadow. But then he married her. Right after the funeral. Jonas's eyes darkened. His hands were still, resting on his knees. "He didn't hit me," she continued, "but sometimes I think that would have been easier. He'd just say things, all the time, every day, about how I looked, how I ate, called me a fat cow. A waste, said no one'd ever want a girl like me, said I was just like my mom, soft and stupid." She swallowed hard, voice trembling. I believed him for a long time. Jonas didn't move, but his jaw clenched, tight enough that the muscle flickered in his cheek. "I wrote this letter the day he tore up my sketchbook," she said, unfolding the paper fully now. "I thought maybe my real dad would come get me, thought maybe he'd want to know I was still here." She set the letter gently on the table between them. It was written in careful, looping letters, the kind only a child could make hopeful, messy, and painfully sincere. The last line read, "Please come get me. I promise I'll be good." "I never sent it," she whispered. "Didn't even know where to send it. But I kept it anyway, like maybe it meant something, even if he never saw it." Jonas leaned forward slowly. He didn't touch the letter, didn't speak, but his eyes stayed on it a long time. When he finally looked up, his gaze met hers, and she saw something fierce in it. Not pity, not softness, recognition, rage, and something else, something protective. His voice didn't come, but his silence spoke loud. Lottie wiped her eyes on her sleeve and folded the letter back up, slower this time, almost with care. She tucked it into her pocket and gave him a small, sad smile. "Thanks for listening." Jonas didn't nod, didn't grunt, but when he rose and added another log to the fire, the gesture was quiet and deliberate, and somehow it felt like a vow. The days lengthened gently, like a slow inhale from the land itself. Sunlight stretched longer across the clearing each afternoon, and the chill in the mornings began to retreat. Life in the cabin found its rhythm. neither rushed nor idle. Tasks became habits, and habits grew roots. Jonas rose before dawn as always, silent and sure-footed, but now there were 2 cups on the table each morning, one for him, one for Lottie. She didn't fill the silence with chatter. She learned to read his rhythms, to watch his gestures like words, to listen to the unspoken. He pointed, showed, nodded. She followed, asked only when necessary, and more often than not, figured things out on her own. One morning, he handed her a fishing rod, rough but sturdy. She raised her brow in confusion. He simply turned toward the creek and started walking. She followed, rod in hand. The creek was louder up close, running cold and quick over smooth stones. Jonas crouched by the edge, showing her how to bait the hook with steady fingers. Lottie watched carefully, mirroring his hands. She'd never been taught to fish. The only rods she'd seen were in department store windows, bright plastic things with cartoon fish printed on the sides. This was different, real. She cast clumsily at first, lines splashing too hard, snagging on reeds. Jonas didn't sigh or roll his eyes. He just waited, silent but present. When she finally got the motion right, when the line arched clean and true, he gave a short nod. Approval. It took over an hour, but when her rod twitched and she yelped in surprise, Jonas was already at her side. The fish was small, slick, and beautiful. She held it in her hands like treasure. Back at the cabin, she cleaned it with his help, wrinkling her nose at the smell. He handed her a pot, and she smiled. My turn. She gathered wild garlic, a few sprigs of wood sorrel, some thyme she'd been drying near the fire. She moved around the tiny kitchen space with care, dicing, stirring, seasoning. The fish went in last, the broth bubbling with slow promise. Jonas watched her work, leaning against the doorframe. She didn't ask him to taste it. She just set a bowl in front of him when it was done and sat down across the table. He took one bite, then another, said nothing. She narrowed her eyes playfully. That's either the best stew you've ever had or the worst, and I don't know which. A grunt. She rolled her eyes. That's not helpful. A pause. Then, quietly rough, cracked from disuse, he spoke. Just 4 words. You're stronger than you think. Herr. Lottie froze. He didn't look up from his bowl. Just kept eating, as if he hadn't just broken a decade of silence with a sentence that landed in her chest like sunlight through storm clouds. Her eyes stung, not with sadness, but with something else, something tender. She smiled and gave a quiet laugh, not mocking, but soft and true. Jonas didn't laugh, but a flicker crossed his face, like a shadow of something once known. He glanced at her drawing pad on the shelf, at the herbs drying by the window, and at the patch of green beyond the door where sprouts had begun to break the soil. The cabin felt warmer that night. The fire crackled louder, the shadows danced slower, and for the first time in years, both of them sat in the same silence, not as strangers, but as something closer to kin. The knock came just past midday, a slow, deliberate thump against the wooden door that hadn't heard visitors in years. Lottie froze, a bundle of kindling in her arms. Jonas, crouched near the hearth inspecting a bent stovepipe, rose to his full height, face unreadable but alert. He glanced at her once, then crossed to the door. No one knocked on Jonas Carver's door. No one ever came this far up the mountain unless they were desperate or foolish. When he opened it, the figure standing there was neither. "Afternoon, Jonas," said Miss Charity Bell, boots muddy and bonnet slightly askew, though her posture remained firm as stone. Lottie gasped softly, recognizing her from town, the preacher's wife, the one who always spoke kindly to children and looked folks in the eye, even when others wouldn't. She had a satchel slung over one shoulder and a cane in her gloved hand, though it looked more ceremonial than needed. Charity's gaze drifted past Jonas and landed on Lottie, who stood near the table now, eyes wide with uncertainty. "Well now," Charity said, stepping forward before Jonas could stop her. "You're not alone after all." Jonas didn't move to block her. He only stepped aside, slow and silent, like a man unsure whether to fight or flee. Charity walked into the cabin as if she'd been there before. Her eyes took in everything, the clean floor, the fresh herbs hung to dry, the bowl of eggs, the notebook on the windowsill. Then she turned to Lottie and extended a hand. I'm Miss Charity, she said gently, and you must be the girl whose cry brought the mountain to its knees. Lottie hesitated, then set the kindling down and took the offered hand. Charity's grip was strong but warm. My name's Lottie Mae, she said, voice shy but clear. Charity smiled. Of course it is. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a tin of salve and a bundle wrapped in cloth. I heard from the trapper down near Red Pine that Jonas might have use for some things: liniment for joints, balm for cuts. Brought dried elderflower, too, in case either of you catch a chill. She set the bundle on the table and looked once more at Jonas. Didn't expect you to have company. Jonas gave a brief nod, the flicker of a thank you in his eyes. Charity turned back to Lottie and touched her shoulder. You've found a protector, I see. Lottie's eyes filled with something that wasn't quite tears. He didn't have to, but he did. Charity nodded, glancing toward Jonas again. That's the thing about wounded men. Sometimes they protect others because they can't protect themselves. He's just as lost as you, child. Don't forget that. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, a hawk cried over the treetops. Charity bent close and whispered gently, There's goodness here. I can feel it. But evil doesn't give up easy. It always circles back, one way or another. Lottie's breath hitched. She knew who that warning was meant for. Charity straightened and patted her hand. You're safer than you were, but not safe yet. Keep your eyes open and your roots deep. She looked at Jonas once more, her expression unreadable. You still got some fight left in you, Jonas Carver. Don't let it go to waste. Then she was gone, back through the trees, her boots leaving a trail no one else would dare follow. Inside the cabin, the silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence anymore. It was the kind that lingered after a bell had been rung, leaving echoes in the bones. The storm rolled in like a warning, low and dark, the kind of sky that made even the trees seem nervous. Jonas watched it from the porch, one hand gripping the post, the other resting on his belt where his old hunting knife hung. The smell of rain was thick in the air, but something else moved with it, something sour and familiar. Trouble. Lottie was inside, sorting dried beans into a clay bowl, humming under her breath. She didn't notice the shift in Jonas's posture, the way his shoulders tensed, how his eyes narrowed at the figures appearing from the trail below. 4 men on horseback, mud-stained, loud, and riding like they owned the land beneath them. Jonas knew the type: railroad men. Greed in their eyes, weight in their pockets, and no understanding of the land they aimed to conquer. They didn't dismount. They didn't ask permission. The one in front wore a fine hat and a vest too clean for someone who'd ridden this far. His boots were polished, but his eyes were mean. Jonas Carver? He called, voice sharp and practiced. Jonas didn't answer. You're squatting on land the Northern Cross Line's about to own, the man continued. We've got plans for this ridge. Surveyors are coming. We're here to give you a fair warning to vacate. Jonas said nothing. The wind answered for him, shaking the pine boughs. Another rider chuckled. He dumb or just mute? The third man leaned forward in his saddle, chewing on a toothpick. He's the one they say buried a whole family up here, talks to ghosts, not men. But it was the fourth man, thinner, nastier, with a crooked scar down his jaw, who made Lottie's blood run cold. Wayne. He slid off his horse, like a snake uncoiling, and stepped toward the porch. Well, I'll be, he said, a grin spreading across his face. Ain't this just the world turnin' sweet again? Lottie had come to the door when she heard the voices. Now she stood frozen in the frame, her hands gripping the edge, eyes wide with recognition and dread. Wayne looked her up and down with that same cruel leer. There she is. Thought maybe you'd gone and died in a ditch. But no, you found yourself a beast in the woods instead. He turned to Jonas. She's mine, you know. Legally. Was in my house, under my roof. Jonas stepped forward, silent but solid. His presence blocked Wayne's view like a stone wall rising from the earth. Wayne sneered. What, you think you got rights now? She's just a mouth to feed, and a fat one at that. Always was more weight than she's worth. Lottie flinched, but didn't back away. Her heart thundered, but her legs held firm. Jonas didn't speak. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the deed, old but official. He held it up for the railroad man to see, eyes locked on Wayne the whole time. The lead writer squinted. That land signed over to you by Elias Bell himself? Jonas nodded once. The man clicked his tongue. Well, that complicates things. Wayne spat in the dirt. She don't belong to you. Finally, Jonas spoke, his voice low, gravel thick, and steady as mountain rock. She stays. 3 syllables, spoken with the weight of 10 years' silence. Wayne blinked. The other men shifted in their saddles, uneasy. The sky cracked above them with a burst of thunder, and rain began to fall in slow, deliberate drops. Let's go, the lead man muttered. For now. Wayne glared up at Lottie. This ain't over, girl. You hear me? You're mine. But Lottie didn't flinch. And as the men turned their horses and rode back down the path, she stepped forward onto the porch beside Jonas, breathless but proud. He hadn't just protected her, he had claimed her, and for the first time in her life, someone had stood between her and the storm. The rain turned to sleet overnight, hard and cold, needling against the roof like a warning from the heavens. Jonas sat in the rocker by the fire, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The blade whispered against the stone, steady as breath. Across the room, Lottie dozed on her cot, wrapped in every blanket they had. She hadn't spoken much since Wayne rode off, but her eyes said enough. Fear hadn't left her. It had just learned to sit quietly. When the sun rose the next morning, pale and sharp through the cloud bank, the sound of horses returned. Jonas stood before the knock ever came. Lottie jolted upright as boots stomped through mud and fists banged on the door, not a polite knock this time, but a demand. Jonas moved to the threshold, jaw clenched, shoulders squared. Lottie stood behind him, frozen in place, her hands balled at her sides. The door swung open, and Wayne stepped in without waiting. Behind him, 2 of the men from before flanked the porch, hands hovering near the pistols at their hips. But this time, Wayne wasn't smiling. Brought the law with me, he barked. Marshall's on his way up tomorrow with papers. That girl belongs to me by guardianship. You're harboring someone who don't belong to you. Jonas didn't move. Wayne stepped closer, rain dripping from his coat. I told you before, she's mine. You want to fight, old man? You think the law is going to side with a lunatic who talks to himself in the woods? Jonas didn't blink. He took 1 step forward, filling the doorway with his full height. The fire inside flickered behind him, casting long shadows across the floor. Then he spoke, voice low and clear. Every word hit like iron dropped on stone. She stays. Wayne froze mid-step. The men on the porch shifted, glancing at each other. You got no right. Wayne spat. Jonas didn't repeat himself. She don't belong here. Look at her, Wayne hissed. Fat little stray, always begging for scraps, always sniffing around for attention. You think she cares about you? She's using you like she used everyone else. Lottie's breath hitched, but she stood her ground. Jonas didn't flinch. Wayne sneered. You're just a washed-up coward hiding in the woods from a fire you couldn't stop. Jonas's eyes darkened, but his hands remained steady. Get off my land. You gonna shoot me? If you cross that line again, Jonas said, nodding once toward the edge of the porch, you'll find out. Wayne stepped back, not because he wanted to, but because something in Jonas's voice told him the mountain wouldn't bend this time. The other men said nothing. They mounted their horses with eyes averted. Wayne lingered a second longer, face twisted with fury. You think this is over? Law is still the law. I'll be back with it. Jonas didn't reply. Wayne spat into the dirt and turned, disappearing into the fog and trees, swallowed by a silence thicker than the storm. Inside the cabin, the air trembled with something unspoken. Jonas shut the door slowly, the wood thudding into place like the closing of a tomb. He turned to Lottie, who hadn't moved. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a voice that trembled but didn't break, she said, He's not coming back, not through you. And Jonas, jaw set, gave her the faintest nod. He would not let her be taken. Not now, not ever. The story spread faster than rain on dusty ground. By the next morning, down in the crooked streets of Duskwater, tongues were wagging like shutters in a windstorm. Heard he dragged her up there by the hair, muttered Ruthie Parnell behind the bakery counter, kneading dough with extra aggression. They say she's simple, don't know what's good for her. She ain't simple. She's the Carter girl, the fat one. Wayne's stepdaughter, replied old Tom Dorsey, scratching at his jaw. Ran off weeks back. Now she's holed up with Jonas Carver like some wild pet. Pet? Ruthie snorted. More like hostage. That man's not right. Never has been. In the corner of the general store, 2 more voices chimed in, low and eager. They say she's under his spell. Won't come back to town, even when the sheriff sends word. Spell or not, she belongs in school, not in the woods with a madman. The words bounced from porch to pew, from dinner table to bar stool, growing more twisted with each retelling. No one had seen Lottie. No one had heard from Jonas, but that only fed the fire. By Sunday morning, the church was full, not with faith, but curiosity. Miss Charity Bell felt it the moment she stepped through the doors. Eyes turned, murmurs rippled. She walked with her head held high, gloved hands wrapped tight around her worn Bible. After the service, when the crowd spilled out into the yard, she made her way to the gathering knot of women and leaned in just enough to be heard. I heard some of you are talking about Jonas Carver like he's the devil himself, she said, her voice calm but sharp. Silence fell. Ruthie's hands froze mid-gesture. Charity continued, I went up there last week, took medicine. He opened the door. Let me in. And that girl, Lottie Mae, she wasn't chained. She wasn't crying. She was planting a garden. She's just a child, Ruthie muttered. She don't know she's being misled. Charity stepped closer. That child has known more cruelty than most grown men, and she's found the only soul willing to protect her from it. She's with Jonas Carver, someone whispered. He hasn't spoken in years. Well, he speaks now, Charity said. And when he speaks, it's with the voice of a man who's lost everything and still found the strength to stand between a girl and the monster who broke her. There was a shift in the circle, subtle but present. Tom Dorsey cleared his throat. Wayne always did strike me as the wrong kind of man. Mean to his dog, too. Another woman nodded. And Lottie never made trouble. Always quiet. Sweet with the little ones. Maybe she's safer up there than we thought. Charity's eyes moved across each face. Y'all are quick to pass judgment from your porches, but not one of you's walked that trail. You want to know the truth? Go see it for yourselves. She didn't wait for replies. Just turned, skirts brushing against the dust, and walked away. By sundown, the tone had shifted. Not completely, not loudly, but it had shifted. One man left a sack of flour and beans at the edge of Widow's Ridge, no note attached. A young boy, no older than 10, left a bundle of firewood there, too, whispering, for the girl with the drawings. And somewhere, someone whispered, maybe Jonas ain't so bad. The town didn't rise in full, not yet, but something had cracked in the wall of suspicion. And once a wall cracks, it doesn't take much to bring it down. The pews creaked under the weight of suspicion and whispering hearts. Duskwaters Church hadn't seen such a crowd in months. Folks sat shoulder to shoulder, Bibles unopened on laps, eyes forward but restless. The usual murmurs of babies and old bones settling were replaced by a tighter kind of silence, the kind that came when everyone was waiting to hear something that might give them permission to change their minds. The preacher, Reverend Bell, stood at the pulpit with his hands resting lightly on the wooden edge, his eyes sweeping across his congregation. He was a tall man with a soft face weathered not by age but by compassion, and on this morning he wore a gravity that pulled even the wandering gazes back to him. He didn't open with scripture, didn't ask for hymnals, he just spoke. There's been talk, he said plainly, his voice steady as rain on a roof. Plenty of it. About a man in the hills, about a girl who vanished and was found again, about what's proper and what's strange and what isn't anyone's business but God's. A shifting in the pews followed. Ruthie Parnell folded her arms. Tom Dorsey looked down at his boots. A boy in the front row whispered something to his mother, who hushed him with a gentle pat. The preacher looked out the tall window beside the altar, where light streamed through dusty panes and danced along the wall like hope trying to find its footing. Sometimes, he said, turning back to the room, the wounded shelter the wounded. And in that shelter, we see God. The words landed with quiet power, not shouted, not preached, just spoken. He took a breath and continued. Jonas Carver lost his family in fire and silence. That man's been living with ghosts longer than some of us have been alive. And that girl, Lottie Mae, she was cast out into the cold by hands meant to protect her. Yet somehow, by providence or grace, two broken things found each other. And instead of destroying what remained, they built something new. Murmurs rippled through the room, some skeptical, some softened. "I've heard folks say she's being held against her will," Reverend Bell said, his voice rising just slightly. "But I've spoken to my wife, and she saw something else. She saw a girl with dirt under her nails and light in her eyes. She saw a man who had every reason to turn away from the world, but didn't. He let that sit. Then, quieter now, he added, if you think God only works in neat places with tidy stories, then maybe you've forgotten how he came into this world in the first place." No one dared breathe too loud. Compassion doesn't always look the way we expect, and neither does family. A few heads nodded. One woman wiped at her eye. An older man in the back gave a thoughtful grunt. The preacher folded his hands, voice firm but gentle. "You don't have to understand it. You don't even have to approve of it. But before you pass judgment, ask yourself this. When the lost find one another, isn't that something worth honoring?" Silence fell again, but this time it felt different. Heavy, yes, but open, like a door creaked ajar. When the congregation filed out, they didn't talk as much. Some lingered near the steps, others walked slowly home. No one laughed, no one sneered, and no one mentioned the word kidnap again. The tide had shifted, just enough for the wind to change. And somewhere beyond Widow's Ridge, two souls in a cabin would soon feel the ripple. The smoke came first, a thin, ugly ribbon curling into the sky, twisting like a signal of hate. Lottie saw it from the creek, where she'd been rinsing herbs in the cold water. Her heart lurched before her feet even moved. She dropped the bundle of mint and ran. The barn. She tore through the underbrush, branches whipping at her arms, mud sucking at her boots. The closer she got, the thicker the smoke became, acrid and bitter, stinging her throat before she even reached the clearing. Flames danced along the roof of the barn, crackling, greedy. The old wood, dry from a week without rain, caught fast. The heat blasted her as she stumbled into the clearing, gasping. From inside the barn came frantic bleats and panicked thudding. The goats. Without thinking, she ran for the side door, yanking it open with a force she didn't know she had. Smoke poured out, blinding, hot. She dropped low, pulling her sleeve over her mouth and squinting through the haze. The animals huddled at the back, eyes wild. She shouted, coughed, waved her arms, and somehow through instinct or trust, they followed her stumbling path back into the daylight. They spilled out into the clearing, just as Jonas burst through the trees from the other side, axe in hand. His eyes went to the barn, then to Lottie, then to the smoke-blackened goats standing beside her. She was coughing hard, but she was upright. He ran to the barn, but it was already too late. Flames had taken the rafters. A terrible crack split the air as the roof caved inward, sending sparks skyward in a cruel celebration. Lottie stood frozen as the heat pushed them both back, helpless. "My drawings," she whispered, too quietly for him to hear. He did anyway. That night, the fire smoldered down to black ash and glowing coals. Jonas didn't speak as they shoveled dirt over the remains. He didn't need to. His silence was no longer a wall between them. It was a door slowly creaking open. They sat beside the wreckage once it was done, the air thick with the scent of smoke and sorrow. Lottie's face was streaked with ash, her eyes hollow. They did this. Wayne, or one of them. They wanted to scare you out. Jonas didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the pile of charred wood, but he wasn't seeing it. He was somewhere else years ago. He spoke softly, gravel in every word. It was fire before. Lottie turned her head toward him. "They died in it. My wife, Clara, my little girl. I wasn't there in time. The house caught while I was in town. Stove or lantern, they never said. I ran back. Smoke already thick. I kicked the door off the hinges and tried to crawl inside." He paused, jaw tightening, but I couldn't get past the stairs. His voice cracked. "I heard them, screaming, and I couldn't reach them." Lottie didn't speak. Her breath caught in her throat, not from smoke this time, but from the ache in his voice. Raw, unforgiving. Not just grief, punishment. I buried them both the next day, he said. Built the coffins myself. Then I walked into the hills. She reached for his hand. He flinched at first, then let her take it. You saved me, she said, voice thick. Jonas shook his head. I didn't save them. No, she whispered. But you didn't leave me to burn. That has to mean something. They sat together until the moon rose above the ruined barn, its light gentle on the smoke-stained earth. And though the flames had taken the drawings, they had also burned through the final layer of silence between them. What was left was ash, but ash could feed new soil. The courthouse in Duskwater had never held so many souls. Its worn benches groaned beneath the weight of farmers and shopkeepers, mothers with babes, and men with dirt still under their nails from early morning fields. They had come with whispered questions in their hearts and sharp opinions on their tongues, but now they sat quiet, waiting. Miss Charity Bell stood at the front like a woman anchored by truth. Her hat was simple, her hands steady. She turned to face them all. I called this meeting, she began, because lies travel fast, but justice tends to take the long road. Today, we shorten that road. A murmur passed through the crowd. Then the door opened. Lottie Mae stepped into the room, her head high, though her hands trembled at her sides. She wore her mother's dress ivory cotton with a faded blue ribbon at the waist. It was too tight at the chest and loose at the shoulders, but she held herself with dignity. Jonas Carver walked beside her, his broad frame cloaked in his old brown coat, soot still staining the sleeves. The townsfolk parted without being asked, a hush falling like a blanket. They had never seen him in town since the fire, and now here he stood, taller than memory, with silence heavy on his shoulders and a girl by his side. Reverend Bell motioned them forward. State your claim, he said, voice calm. Lottie took a breath. I was cast out, she said, voice quivering but loud enough to carry, by a man who told me I was nothing. I ran into the woods because I thought there was nowhere left for me. She glanced at Jonas, then turned back to the crowd. But he took me in, not with promises, not with lies. He just gave me space to breathe. And when the world came to burn it down, he stood in the doorway and said, She stays. A few gasps rose from the crowd. Someone whispered, She's brave. Then Jonas stepped forward, pulling from his coat a folded parchment, brittle with age. He handed it to Miss Charity, who held it up for the room to see. Deed signed by Elias Bell, she said, her voice ringing with certainty. Gave this land to Jonas after the war. In writing, witnessed, filed. Someone from the back called. Then why all this talk of squatting? Before the question could settle, the door burst open again. Wayne, his boots slammed across the wood floor as he pointed a crooked finger at Lottie. She's mine. That man's a thief and she's a runaway. She's nothing but trouble. He charged at her, face twisted in fury. Jonas stepped between them, but he wasn't alone. Two deputies grabbed Wayne mid-lunge. One of them wrestled his arms behind his back. The other clapped iron cuffs around his wrists. She's mine, Wayne bellowed. She's mine. No, said Lottie, eyes steady and voice like steel. I never was. The room erupted not with chaos, but with applause. Not wild, but certain. A dozen hands slapped benches. A few stood up, nodding, murmuring, She's right. She's right. Miss Charity raised her hand for quiet. Evil often wears a familiar face, she said, but goodness, real goodness sometimes grows in the most unexpected soil. Wayne was dragged from the room in chains, still shouting, his voice shrinking with every step. Jonas placed a hand on Lottie's shoulder. She looked up at him, and he gave her the faintest nod, like a mountain bowing to a single seed. The courthouse held its breath, and then slowly, softly, the town began to breathe again. Differently this time, clearer. They had seen the truth, and now they were ready to stand with it. The barn rose slowly, not with the silence that had once shrouded Jonas's life, but with the sound of hammers striking rhythm and voices lifted in steady, purposeful work. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid eye contact with Jonas Carver now climbed the ridge willingly, carrying lumber, nails, and tools in their wagons. Some brought loaves of bread or jugs of cider. Others brought nothing but their time and their hands. It was enough. Jonas worked harder than all of them, shirt damp with sweat by noon, arms corded with effort. But he didn't work alone, not anymore. Lottie painted the new barn door soft green, the color of life beginning again. She filled the cracks between boards with wildflower seeds, smiling as children gathered round to help press them into the dirt with sticky fingers. The schoolhouse in town had changed too. Its walls had once been lined with faded charts and arithmetic slates, but now something new hung beside the chalkboard, Lottie's drawings. Not the originals the fire had taken those, but fresh ones, redrawn from memory, more vivid than before. Birds in flight, a mountain owl at rest, a girl's hand reaching for a blossom. The children stared in wonder, tracing lines with their eyes. Miss Charity had made the arrangements. "She has a gift," she told the schoolmaster, voice firm with expectation, "and gifts like hers are meant to be shared." So Lottie came down from the ridge once a week, her satchel filled with notebooks and chalk. She taught the young girls to draw, yes, but also to read, to spell, to plant rows of beans and tuck wildflower seeds into the corners of the schoolyard where sunlight lingered. She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. Her presence was steady, like rain that made things grow. Some of the girls whispered stories about her as they worked, how she'd once lived with a bear in the woods, how she'd survived a fire, how the mountain man had come back from the dead just to protect her. Lottie smiled when she heard them. Let them tell stories, she thought. It meant the fear was gone. Back at the cabin, the garden flourished. What had once been a patch of weedy soil was now a quilt of green and color carrots and beans. Yes, but also marigolds, lavender, and poppies that nodded in the wind like tiny flags of hope. Bees buzzed lazily among them. A scarecrow stood watch, dressed in Jonas's old hat and one of Lottie's patched aprons. Jonas tended the coop with quiet care. The chickens clucked without fear. The goats milled peacefully in the pen. Some evenings, he sat on the new barn steps and watched Lottie move among the garden rows, her dress brushing against the blossoms, her hands full of basil and beet greens. He didn't say much, but sometimes, when she caught his eye, he gave a small, contented grunt. It was enough. At night, she sat on the porch and sketched the garden by moonlight, its edges glowing silver. And sometimes, a child's voice could be heard calling up from the trail below, "Miss Lottie, I saw a bird like the one in your drawing." Or, "Mama says we can plant sunflowers now." And Lottie would smile, press her pencil to the page, and know deep in her bones that her roots were planted. She was no longer surviving. She was growing. The sun melted into the mountains like honey poured slow from a jar, painting the sky with colors too tender to name. From the porch of the rebuilt cabin, Jonas and Lottie sat side by side, each holding a chipped bowl of stew that smelled of thyme and wild onion. They ate in the quiet way they'd learned to love, not because there was nothing to say, but because silence had become a kind of language between them. The porch creaked beneath their boots, and the chickens clucked softly in the yard. Somewhere, a whippoorwill called out its evening song, steady and lonesome. Lottie glanced sideways at Jonas. His beard had grown fuller again, the gray thicker than last spring, but his eyes, once hollowed by loss, now held a stillness that didn't feel empty. She smiled, dipping her spoon again. Her stew recipe had gotten better with every batch. "You ever think," she said softly, "that this place was waiting for us both?" Jonas didn't answer with words. He just gave that slow nod of his, the one that said, "Yes, I've thought that, and more." She leaned back in her chair, bowl cradled in her lap, and let the warmth of the evening settle over her bones. The garden below swayed in the breeze, a patchwork of green and gold. The new barn stood strong behind it, its fresh timbers still smelling faintly of pine. The scarecrow smiled crookedly from the center row, guardian of vegetables and children's laughter. Then, from the trail that wound up the ridge, came a soft crunch of footsteps. Lottie sat up straighter. Jonas's hand rested instinctively on the armrest, not tense, just alert. They both knew that sound by now, not danger, but something more delicate, something reaching out. A small figure emerged from the trees, carrying a threadbare sack over one shoulder and wearing a dress too thin for the cooling night. The child was maybe 9 or 10, all angles and nerves, her dark hair matted, eyes wide like a deer caught between running and hoping. She paused at the edge of the clearing, unsure. Lottie stood slowly, setting her bowl aside. She didn't rush. She didn't call out. She just opened her arms. "You're safe now," she said. The words carried across the clearing, soft but sure. The girl blinked, once, then again, and her lower lip trembled. She crossed the last few steps in a slow, hesitant walk that turned into a run. She flung herself into Lottie's arms like someone who'd been holding her breath too long. Jonas watched, his face unreadable, but his eyes full. Lottie knelt down and held the girl tightly, murmuring reassurances, brushing the twigs from her hair. Then she looked up at Jonas, still holding the child, and smiled a smile lit from within by something stronger than happiness. Home. The porch welcomed them both as they stepped up. Jonas disappeared into the cabin for another bowl and another spoon. The girl sat between them now, small fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic. She didn't speak, but she ate, slowly at first, then with more hunger than pride. When the stars blinked open above the pines and the wind turned cooler still, Jonas draped his old coat over her shoulders without a word. The girl didn't resist. Lottie pulled her closer, smoothing her hair back. "You don't have to go back," she said gently. "You get to grow now." And the girl, who had no name to offer yet nodded against her shoulder. In that quiet, beneath the hum of crickets and the slow creak of the rocking chair, something sacred settled over the porch. They weren't father and daughter, they weren't bound by blood, but they were a family, made not by chance, but by choice. Built not in perfection, but in the ashes of sorrow, stitched together by grace. And as the fire inside the cabin flickered to life once more, the garden behind them swayed, and the mountain, once a place of solitude, echoed with the gentle rhythm of healing begun anew.